I'll remind you.
Well, sure. It's easier to define. Let's go through everything from the past 10 years and just say all of that.
So they created bylaws for the committee, but they haven't done it.
Essentially,
Yeah.
It says things like,
I came back to the new things.
And, of course, it's gonna be all this big stuff without any content.
and I'm trying to figure out how to go to our site and ask those questions.
So that's,
Yeah.
president.
So I'll leave it in
Now, is it still looking like there are some folks who are still holding on about not going to? So that is not
So I
important.
think that they said zero in the shape of the tree, but there's also been no application for it, so that's
Well, it's interesting too, because, so Brenda is up against Brenda, I started at Texas Constitution Tarot, so I'm just trying to figure out like, what makes the most sense for them around this issue, or this issue that applies? But I'm just wondering, is it seen as, like, you know, Chavez and Tarot, yeah, exactly.
No official record, we are working on our strategic plan, and part of that is, yeah, partnerships. Better use ourselves, yeah.
Yeah, but I'd like to, yeah. Right, in yeah, well.
If
audiences show up right at curtain time. So thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I have some notes because I'm not very good extemporaneously. My name is Heather Parrish, and I'm the chair of the Womack Lecture Planning Group and also the Library Communications Specialist. Welcome to today's Womack Panel Discussion on a topic that lies at the intersection of information, ethics, and societal values. Censorship, ethics, and intellectual freedom. Thank you. I'm very excited to moderate today's discussion with our distinguished panelists. In an era where information flows freely and ideas take center stage, the issues of book bans, intellectual freedom, and censorship have become increasingly complex. As we engage in this conversation, I hope that we can foster an atmosphere of open dialogue, respect, and curiosity. Our hope is that this panel will not only deepen your understanding of the complexities surrounding censorship, but also inspire reflection on the principles that underpin intellectual freedom in our ever-changing world. So our panelists include Dr. John Biden, English professor and president of the Fresno State chapter of the California Faculty Association, Mr. Marcellus Cummings, director of Fresno State Cross-Cultural and Gender Center, Dr. Andrew Fiala, philosophy professor and director, Fresno State Ethics Center, and Dr. Emily J.M. Knox, an information ethics professor from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and this year's Womack lecturer. Dr. Knox will also be delivering our annual Womack lecture titled Book Banning and the Culture Wars this evening at 6 p.m. right down the hall in the Ellipse Gallery. So thank you for joining us on this exploration of censorship, ethics, and intellectual freedom. So let's get started. Any opening remarks? Well, I think I have something for you to start off with, and this is for all of you. In one word, describe your outlook on freedom of expression in the United States today. One word. Threatened.
Important. Challenging right now. Besieged.
It's the English professor right there. Let's see here. I was going to say, Delia, can you get the batteries for this one? Thank you. All right, slightly longer format. In one sentence, how would you define intellectual freedom and why is it important in a democratic society? Let's just get the terms out of the way.
Intellectual freedom is the right of everyone to look for information and to absorb information without restriction. It's important for, it's more than one sentence, sorry.
We can talk about why it's important.
Okay, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I would add that open societies flourish when there's intellectual freedom, and when there is a lack of intellectual freedom, then we have a closed society and authoritarian regimes can rise and take advantage of that.
Can you all hear me? I believe that intellectual freedom is the right to seek, receive, hold, and disseminate information from all points of view without restriction. And I think it's important, I believe it's important in a democratic society because that is how we exchange ideas free-flowingly and evolve.
I would say that intellectual freedom is the right to access information, any and all information, the opportunity to do so. I think this incorporates access, and the reason that this is important for a democratic society is that we need, in a democratic society, to have as many ideas and opportunities for flourishing liberation as possible. Sorry. Adding a lot of words.
It was a bit of a run-on, but it's still one sentence.
There was a semicolon.
Thank you all, okay. Now with no restrictions on form. Let's talk a little bit about freedom of expression versus harmful content, or quote-unquote harmful content. This is for Dr. Knox and Dr. Fiala. Should there ever be any limits on the types of content that can be published or made available to the public, children, or particular groups such as incarcerated individuals?
What's important about that question is thinking about who is making those limits. So it's not so much that everything should always be available to everyone at any point in time. The issue for me is always who is making that decision and why are they making that decision. Censorship is about power, and so often people use their own power to say what other people should have rights to. If we think about just incarcerated people, what you find often is that this is based on fears that the warden has about what people might be reading in jail. It's not so much about the people who are in jail and the access that they need to certain types of information. It's much more about how usually the warden, understands the people who are incarcerated. So my answer to that is always be very suspicious of people who want to take away your access to information. They are saying much more about themselves than they are saying anything about you.
Yeah, the power piece obviously important. Individuals have a right to free expression, a right to read. That shows up in this discussion, that there is such a thing as a right to read. And individual rights are obviously important, but of course there are social limits to all of our rights. No right occurs in isolation. Rights are in conflict with one another, and there are social goods that can limit our rights in various ways. That's the tricky part. So like, we're talking about books. I mean, like books like The Anarchist Cookbook, Mein Kampf, which was banned in Germany until just a few years ago, probably for good reasons, although I'd love to hear what you think about that. The society has interests in limiting access to information. I'm pretty much like, let's have free access for individuals, but I also understand that there are social reasons, utilitarian reasons to limit access to some ideas for some people. And like the tricky one is with kids. Prisoners, of course, obviously, but what do we do with children? And there are restrictions on what children have access to in terms of alcohol, tobacco, firearms, pornography. How do we negotiate that in terms of books?
Any follow-up, any additional thoughts?
You're right, yeah. I also, I have a follow-up question on that is, we talk about the social reasons, but the social reasons from whose perspective? That's where it really, the tension comes in and where the culture war issues come in. So given that, Mr. Cummings, Dr. Biden, in what ways do concerns about cultural sensitivity or what people might consider problematic ideas, where does that intersect with intellectual freedom?
I think that concerns about cultural sensitivity, how they intersect with intellectual freedom is nuanced in ways. I think the challenge right now is we try to have these sweeping conversations without thinking about the nuance of it all. And I think it's important that we respect diverse cultures and ensuring that there is an uninhibited flow of ideas, but there has to be a balance in terms of the cultural sensitivity of things. So I think there is an intersection there, but I think we need to find where that balance lies oftentimes, because what may be cultural to other people could be offensive in some ways to others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should not be shared or it should not be, the access should not be there. So I think the real issue is the balance of it all and how we disseminate that information. And to the previous question is about who is disseminating that information and who is trying to prohibit it from being shared.
Yeah, cultural sensitivity is an interesting topic, one that I think about a lot as an openly gay person who teaches at this university LGBTQ literature courses, and I'm teaching that class this semester. Because on the one hand, yes, I want that class to be one where cultural sensitivity, and not just toward LGBTQ people, but toward a whole range of difference, when it comes to identities, communities, and experiences, are respected. Because I do believe on some level, like, if we're gonna be social beings, we've gotta figure out, like, if not how to love each other, at least how to respect one another, and understand that we can coexist with differences. So, but when it comes to the intellectual expression, I'm much less committed to that always overlapping with cultural sensitivity. I think the research is better if you are culturally sensitive. But I also don't know that in every instance, intellectual inquiry, research, publication, etc., must include cultural sensitivity, either because it's not demanded of the project, or because it's not true to the person who's conducting the research. So, and in that case, I would just say that those expressions of intellectual inquiry are going to announce themselves as culturally insensitive, if in fact that's what they are. And I don't have a problem with their existing, but we also need an informed populace to be able to see it.
Right, so what I'm picking up from that is that, you know, the research is better with this cultural sensitivity and its intersection, but the ability to culturally express, in your view, would take a higher priority in the situation?
So, can you say that one more time?
To boil it down, would the ability to culturally express oneself outrank in priority the cultural sensitivity need?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in coming up with a scenario in which that's the choice that one has to make. I'm not sure it always is a choice that one has to make, but I guess I would say that, for example, I've often had students who will seek me out, they're LGBTQ students. We haven't had preachers on our campus for a while. At least I haven't seen them recently.
Every year in the library.
Okay, good, all right, well then I'll know where to go. But my students will often say, oh, I had to walk by this, you know, preacher, right? And I don't feel that that person should be banned from expressing their views in this public space. That's often an unpopular opinion when I express that, but you know, that individual is expressing a particular cultural expression that's coming from a particular place. It conflicts, you were talking about conflicting rights, it conflicts with others, and I think I would be, I would be loath to say we can't have that expression because of cultural sensitivity, in part because I'm also concerned about power. Who is going to determine what is culturally sensitive, right? So we can say, oh, well, we only want this speech, but are the people in power really going to agree with us?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an important clarification. And just so you know, we have the exact same conversation in the library every year. I get calls from the research desk. Thank you all.
And I would just add to that, back to the point of that balance piece and having that conversation, because I think it's all contextual, because you'll be hard pressed to use that same brush for every situation. And to his point, I think it's important for people to see different ways of expression, even if we don't agree with it, even if they are unpopular, to be able to decide how to engage and to gain and use that for further knowledge. That's not saying that people have the freedom or should have the freedom to be outwardly disrespectful and discriminatory, but I don't think there should be a limit on, or there should be someone being inhibited from speaking whatever their truth is, if it is not causing immediate harm or it's not violent language. But I think, again, you have to find that balance and have the conversation about it, because you'll be hard pressed, again, to be able to use that brush to paint every single situation.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
And then direct the question to Professor Knott about John Stuart Mill?
Okay.
So, part of the,
I mean, one of the arguments about untrammeled free speech, the marketplace of ideas, is that the best cure for bad ideas is better ideas, and is discourse about the badness or the weakness of those ideas. And I mean, from an educator standpoint, we're doing a disservice to our students if we don't let them hear the bad ideas, right? And then we need to empower them with arguments in which they can use then to argue against those bad ideas. And one of the issues about censorship, as I know you're going to talk about this evening, is we don't hear all the ideas, then suddenly bad ideas sneak up on us, or go underground and then permutate into violent, kind of subversive stuff. So better let the sunlight shine, kind of thing. Care to talk about John Stuart Mill?
So John Stuart Mill talks about the argument from truth, which is that truth has to be contested or it's just opinion. What I try to say with my students, though, is that that's not necessarily going to be an easy process. There seems to be sometimes this idea that that contestation will not be difficult. It won't be that you won't actually feel these feelings of like, I am hurt because I heard you say this thing. That's not really what this argument is about. This really goes to the idea that when we work through what is true, that in fact there are people who will never agree with you on that point, and that as you get to, I mostly talk about this in terms of like social justice and a more just society, that everybody won't be there with you as you get towards a more just society, that it is actually a path that you have to travel, and you will go forward and you will go back, and it's always ongoing. There seems to be this idea when we think about things like harmful language, the idea of harm in general, that we can somehow make it a human condition to not feel that. And that's not possible. It's not possible to do that. You will get hurt. People will say terrible things. That does not necessarily mean that that we should curtail people's rights to freedom of expression. Because what we see, and this is so true today, that in fact, when that happens, it is marginalized voices that get curtailed first. That is sort of inevitable, because that is how power works. This to me is really what Mill was talking about, like when he was talking about how do we think about what eventually we understand to be truth. That you have to be able to argue with people about what is true, and that it has to be held for reason, and you can't have this discernment and reason unless you hear what other people say. You mentioned my comp, I don't want to go out too long, but
Oops.
no, but that did not keep Germany from having neo-Nazi parties. In fact, the rise of the far right in Europe has been markedly high, even though they have anti-hate speech laws, especially in Germany. You have, Holocaust denial is illegal in Germany. That has not seemed to make a difference politically. This is because it's actually about the society itself. It's not necessarily just about what people are reading. It's actually about how do we understand people as human beings within our society as a whole. And that is much more difficult than to say, we're going to make this illegal, we're going to ban this. It's much harder to say, I am going to treat you as a human being with all the dignity and rights that you deserve because you are a human being.
Okay, so going off of that idea of arguing for truth, we've talked for about 7 or 8 minutes now about sort of dealing with the negative aspects of pushback on things, but how can a commitment to intellectual freedom support diverse voices and perspectives? In what way is it a positive force rather than a pushback force? Go ahead. Jump in.
Well, I'm not giving this talk today, but I give a talk on intellectual freedom and social justice, and it's basically about how you can't have social justice without intellectual freedom. How can you hear about critical race theory if people say you shouldn't read about it? You have to be able to be exposed to ideas about justice in order to work towards a more just society. I just don't see how that's possible without intellectual freedom. What we find with people who engage in censorship practices is that they are often afraid of what an outcome that they can't control might be, right? That they have decided that this is the right way for whatever to happen, and they have predetermined an outcome. Intellectual freedom means that in many ways you have to trust your fellow human beings. This is often quite difficult. And so I understand this want for control, but you can't actually control other people. What you can do is present options for them, and they may or may not agree with those options. So that's really how I think about these two issues when they come up.
Thank you. Dad?
I'll just add, she mentioned the word power in her, Dr. Knox mentioned the word power in her first comment, and I believe that the commitment to intellectual freedom gives those diverse perspectives power that they or otherwise wouldn't have, and that's what censorship tries to do, is remove that power. And if we are uplifting those marginalized voices and making sure they have the freedom to share their stories, share experience, share their expression, then I believe we as a society are more productive because we are able to hear those things. And to Dr. Knox's point about, lost my train of thought, about folks, people who have power and who are trying to censorship are afraid of what information others may have, what stories may be told. There's the old adage that whoever wins the war writes the story. The victor always writes the story from their perspective. So folks who are marginalized, when they do have this power of intellectual freedom, those who are trying to censor it are usually afraid of losing some of the power that they have in terms of creating this narrative or controlling that expression.
Thank you. Yeah, good point. Dr. Bynum?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think a lot of this, I really like what Emily was saying about social justice and intellectual freedom. I'm thinking about the question of literacy, for example, and the peoples in this nation that have been and continue to be prevented from having access, for example, just to the written word or to an education, much less to the stories that would represent them, reflect them in some way, and just how important that is. And it reminds me, this is a silly example, I feel somehow moved or called to share this, but when I was growing up, I was probably in junior high. I was in a little town called Layton, Utah. Utah was not, a sort of hotbed of inclusivity during that period, which would have been the early 80s. And I used to go to the bookstore. I loved books, and I would go to my Walden Books. And one day I saw a book on the bottom shelf, and it was The Joy of Gay Sex. Right? And it was this kind of like illustrated, you know. And I remember finding it and kind of like, trying to get it off the shelf and then take it to another section of the bookstore because I wanted to look at it. And was I just trying to look at the kind of pictures that my parents would have called dirty pictures? Well, yes. But was I also trying to find information about queer people? Yes. I was trying to find something, right? And so that little example, right, would lead to a kind of, was just one step in a journey toward a kind of personal liberation where I could come to sort of a point of acceptance that wouldn't happen for many years later. And then discover queer theory in the early 90s where it was kind of exploding, and pursue that, go on and get a PhD. In other words, all of that, I'm not saying that it's the joy of gay sex that made all that happen. But I'm not saying it didn't either. So those are the sorts of things where I feel like somebody in that bookstore decided it was okay to order that in Layton, Utah, and have that at the one mall in the one, sort of mainstream bookstore. And I was lucky enough to find it. So I think that's important, that there are different sort of levels of liberation that sort of like play into that as well.
We're all the better for it. All right, now I'd like to go to our largest section. This has the most bullet points in any of my sections here, and this is Dr. Knox's specialty. So these are mostly directed to you, but I would like anybody else to jump in if they have additional thoughts, all right? This section is about book bans and challenges specifically, which I think is why a few people might actually be here. So first up is, I know you're going to talk more about this tonight, but can you give us a capsulized version for what the primary motivations behind book bans and censorships is in today's society?
Sure, it's that reading is very powerful. So reading can change who you are as a person. If I ask any of you, what's your favorite book? What's the book that changed your life the most? I'm sure most of you would have an answer. I won't ask. But that's not a coincidence. In fact, people often argue with me that people who challenge books don't like books, don't believe in books. It's actually completely opposite. They truly believe in the power of books. They believe in it so much that they want to take books away from you. This is counterintuitive because it doesn't seem like that would be the case. But when you think about, this is something that we really believe in, literacy, reading, can actually change your soul. It can change who you are as a person. So that's really the main reason. I have lots of other things that go along with that about like parenting and libraries, but it's really mostly about the power of reading.
Can I, if you don't mind me directing a question that came up over lunch, and you mentioned the sacredness of books, which I think is really important. I mean, some books, literally, like they're holy objects, right? They get banned, and people do things with books that they're mystical objects. And I think, in light of what you just said, you just want your books to be in place, right? Everybody has a sacred book. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the book, the Codex, is an amazing technology. It is a technology, actually, I'm going to pull something out right now.
Visualize.
So I have this book called The Book from MIT. If you think about what this is, it pulls information across time and space in a way that I could just pull it out of my bag, just like that. Books are often seen as not just a mundane object, I'll ask this again tonight, but I asked this at lunch, but how many of you break the spines of your books? How many of you do not ever break the spines of your books? Yeah, so this is a brand new book. I haven't yet broken the spine of it. I could break the spines of my books. But why do we treat books this way? They have a power outside of their mundanity, right? Like there's something about them. And this is, I do relate this to issues in, especially with the Reformation, the translations of the Bible, where it was put into, lingua franca for people so that you could read this holy text yourself and therefore be able to save your soul. These are actually received understandings of reading that have come to us that are very prevalent in the global north. What do we do in classes? I have my students read. That's not, a coincidence. I actually want you to read so you can change your knowledge structures and understand things more. But books themselves, have this kind of otherworldly understanding. Like when I think about, I'll just bring this right back down to the practical. So for those of you who don't know, Brandon Sanderson is a really well-known fantasy author. He's raised almost $20 million for his leather-bound book. This book is available in mass market paperbacks. It's available in all sorts of ways, but people want that leather-bound, gilded edges version of the book, right? There's something about having beautiful books even that actually even raises this idea of what a book is. You can see that in your special collections with your books. I'm sure you have beautiful coffee table books at home. Would you ever put those on the floor and have someone step on them? No, that's not something that people usually do with their books, right? This is why burning books is so anathema to us, right? Burning is actually quite different from banning. Burning is about a cleansing ritual of removing these ideas altogether. But when we think about those images of books being burned, it hits you in a very different place because of this sacred understanding that we have of a book. I mean, imagine if I just took a lighter to this book. This is a $15 book. You can get it on Amazon. You probably have it, all these MIT essentials here, right? It's not a big deal. But the idea of doing that, you can't even imagine it. How would someone do that? Who would light that match to burn a book? Even if it's not a big deal, just a book you got at the grocery store. So I try to think more about books as sacred objects. This is a secular understanding of sacred, but how they operate in our society as a whole.
So what I'm also getting from that is it's not just that's the impetus for people who want to censor or ban books, and they're considering that this is sacred and this could also be defiled by the ideas within it, but also that the people who want to protect the books, for them, their own stories, their own versions of books are also sacred. So we're also kind of fighting over this territory of what counts, right? So given that situation, that tension, what are the impacts that book bans have on community environments? How do they have a positive or negative, if that's possible, impact in a community?
So book bans tear communities apart. It's difficult for them to recover after they've happened. You find out things about your neighbors that you didn't necessarily want to know. I sometimes get calls from people who are just in despair over something that's happened in their community. Also, they make spaces, people more wary about certain spaces. I don't know if I actually belong in this space, which is the worst thing that could happen to a library. Everybody belongs in the library, right? They also make you realize that maybe I am not able to live my life with integrity right now. There are people who will be against me as a person. So I am not going to say what my truth is, because that is not going to work out with me right now. I just need to get out of here before I can do that. There are a lot of ramifications. They affect library budgets. They affect the politics of communities for many, many years. They make it so that it can be difficult to hire people into certain positions. It makes people question whether or not they wanted to go into service professions at all, right? Do I really want to be a teacher right now? No, you could not pay me to be a K through 12 teaching position at the moment. Which a lot of teachers are saying, that's right, you cannot pay me, I'm leaving. There are all of these ramifications because it's not really about the books, even though it seems like it's all about the books. It's actually about so many other things that are going on in society.
Yeah, to build on some of those other things that are going on in society, I think that there's, the books become, they're either perceived genuinely as the mechanism whereby people can discover themselves, learn about themselves, and perhaps most importantly, join forces with other people like them in order to better their own situation, right? Or they might be perceived genuinely as doing that, but they also might just be kind of like these objects, like this is what we're signaling is that we hate these people, and we're signaling, what we don't want to say is this, but we're going to let it play out in this other way, and we're going to use other terms to talk about it. Representations of gender and sexuality, they're just too adult for, younger readers. But I think that question of identity and that question of liberation and that question of social justice is so deeply tied to books, and it's not an accident that of all of the books that have been challenged in 2023, according to the American Library Association, I want to say something like, and there's a huge number, it's a big leap from 2021 to 2022. If I'm not mistaken, there are more challenged books in 2023 than 2021 and 2022 combined, right? So, and of those, some 40 something, and the library might be able to help me, percent are books that represent the LGBTQ community or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Those are the books that people are targeting. So that's not just an accident. That's because there's an agenda, right? And I think we have to be very clear that whatever is being argued about, like the malleable little minds or the confused, preteens or whatever, those are all, this isn't about that. This is about attempting to invalidate an identity of community and to prevent people from finding their rightful place in society and asserting themselves and saying, I belong here.
So, the thing that I'm feeling is a huge amount of suppression in general across the board.
I think suppression, it also sends a message to people that their stories aren't important, and it emboldens others to act in ways that are less inclusive and downright discriminatory and prejudiced because of some of those talking points that use other reasons for the bans as opposed to what it clearly is, and a lot of it is to silence voices.
Can I throw something? It seems to me that
the book ban is like a symptom of a larger political and social problem. I think also what you were saying. And I mean, really, it's ultimately about social control and limiting people's rights to be who they want to be or read what they want to be. And we're in the middle of this nightmare disaster. I'll be honest about this. I'm not happy about the way our country's unfolding. I'm very worried. There are authoritarian tendencies in the background, and the book banning is just like a symptom of this larger question. And the question I think on the table is, what kind of a world do we want to live in? We want to live in a political world where there's freedom of speech and freedom to read, a world where we're socially inclusive, where we're willing to evolve and change our ideas, we're willing to think about new thoughts. Or, it's not a dumb idea on the other side of that, but the other idea is we just want to stay always the same. We want to keep things exactly how they were, and even if that means violating people's rights along the way, well, that's the way it has to go, because we want to stick with what we've always had and what we always know. I mean, these are huge, huge issues about who and what we are as human beings, how we organize ourselves politically, and what we expect out of our social lives. It's a very, very important topic, but man, behind all this is a whole bunch of other huge topics, and I don't know, my worries.
I mean, I think, thank you for putting them into words, because I do think that they're very much on the front of mind for a lot of people here. So we've got a few minutes left here before we start taking some questions from anybody here who has them. One of the questions that I do have, and bringing it back down to a more practical level, is, in what ways can we ethically advocate for intellectual freedom in the face of censorship? Especially, we got 2 phone calls about this panel already, and trust me, I was expecting more. But what do you say? What do you say when this comes up and somebody has, quote unquote questions? How do you effectively or ethically advocate?
So it really depends on context. First, I try to remind people that the library has something for everybody. One thing I've been thinking about recently is these books are not necessarily for you as a person, right? There are other books that are for you. So one of the most popular genres is Amish romances. Perhaps that's the book that would be better for you at this time. I also think that you really just have to say that you are advocating for everyone's right to intellectual freedom, including the people who are upset about these books. They have the right to say that they're upset, that they don't want to read them, that they don't want their children to read them, but they don't actually have the right to make those decisions for other people, for other kids. That seems to be where there's a bit of an issue, and I know I've gotten pushback on this because, of course, I'm very worried about the children of these people, right? That in fact this is, this is not upholding their own rights to information, which is why I think about context. How are you talking to this particular person who is upset about it? But also you realize when they start talking that they are talking about all sorts of other things. So it moves from the book to all these other things going on in the wider world. And you realize that, in fact, I will talk about this, the world is actually changing quite a bit. I talk about things like demographic change in our country, that there are more people at the table, that you have to think instead of what do I lose with this changes, as opposed to what do I gain with the changes that are happening in our country. Pretty sure California is already a majority minority state, but
Fresno County is not.
So I'll just tell you a little bit about how I think about this in my work. So where we see a lot of these particular challenges happening are in what I call tipping point places. So they are places that have been predominantly white for for a very long time and are now not. And it's actually not as much as people might think. It's actually in about the 10% to 15% change, because you actually see the changes on the street. I actually talk about this in terms of where my family is from, which is South Carolina. So when I was growing up in South Carolina, I didn't grow up in South Carolina. When I visited in South Carolina, it used to be that everybody in South Carolina was white or black. That was it. You were white or you were black. But through the 90s and the 2000s, there were more and more migrants from Mexico to work on the farms there. And so you can get actual Mexican food in Williamsburg County, South Carolina, which is not near anything. It's 40 minutes from Florence, if you've heard of Florence. This is a huge change in the culture of these tiny towns in South Carolina. And people's reaction to this change has been quite visceral. The Walmart looks different. It does not look the way it used to look. There are more Goya foods available in Walmart than there used to be. There are more people speaking in Spanish. And how people react to that can actually come out in how they think about the books on the shelf in the library. And that's sort of what you realize, you'll see when I talk about it this evening, that they start talking about the book and then it becomes this whole other thing, as you were saying. It is about all of the changes in our world, which I just want to say we should have anticipated. We're now a generation outside of the civil rights movement. We are going to be a minority country in 2040. There is no way we could not have gone through what we are going through right now. These are huge changes in our society. As I said before, everybody is not going to be happy about these changes. We had a reactionary election to our first Black president. We should have really anticipated that we'd be going through this incredibly painful time of retrenchment. That's really all I see right now, which is I was losing power. What can I do to keep that power with every fiber of my being? What can I do? And it is going to be really hard. I'm really worried about this year. I think this is going to be one of the worst election years of our entire lives. The books are a lagging indicator. They are a place where people have power locally. You can say, you can go to your local board meeting and say all sorts of things. You can't necessarily go to Congress and do that. So I do feel like it's just going to get worse and worse.
But in the meantime, when we have these conversations to talk about, what I'm hearing is, acknowledge the fact that things are changing with people and that it can be frightening, but also acknowledge that these voices have rights and they should be upheld and even celebrated.
Do that?
I would just say when it comes to intellectual freedom and academic freedom more specifically, one of the things that is most alarming to me right now, at least as an academic, is the huge backlash against students and activists speaking on behalf of Palestine, and the ways in which the media will fail to question, right, what they've been told a certain phrase means, or what wearing a scarf means, or what. And so I would say it's really important that we get very curious about those things. Like, what is that? Someone told me that's a terrorist scarf. Is it? And get really curious about that and investigate and ask questions, because when student groups can't even form on their campuses or hold a rally because anything that they might say would be considered offensive, would be considered as crossing a line, that's a huge problem. And so I see that happening a lot right now, resignation of university presidents over this issue, that sort of thing. And just the awful way, the New York Times, awful way that, the New York Times couldn't stop covering that issue, and they covered it in the worst possible way. So we have to be skeptical of the media that we consume, and we have to be really curious about what we're told in this environment.
I like that, maintaining curiosity instead of putting on the judgment hat immediately, right? Okay. I'd like to open up for some questions. If anybody has a question for our panel, you can raise your hand or bring a mic up to you. Yeah.
Hi, I live in the Central Valley, California, and I appreciate this conversation. My confusion is, we talk about this intellectual freedom, but what we're grappling with is like spirit work, right? Like we're up against people's trauma, and I'm like, it doesn't matter how smart I am, that's not gonna stop the room and have space for the multiplicities of identities, let alone unpack it, and I'm not a therapist. So maybe just as educators, what are some practices that we can retain that can help maybe cultivate safe space, or maybe if it's not my value, how do I stop, even though it hurts my feelings, to allow other values to be heard? Just some practical wisdom. Please.
So I think that one thing to know about education is that it is actually not about safety. Education actually makes you a different person than who you were before. So the way I think about this is, my dad was first gen, I'm not first gen. He is so different from the rest of his family. He has become a different person, mostly because of class, than his family, the rest of his family in South Carolina. It's very difficult to have what might be a safe space when you are dealing with education. I prefer the various terms of brave spaces, but what I really try to get people to understand is that you actually might be hurt or harmed by something you hear in this particular space. So this actually goes to the Israel and Palestine issue. People are going to be offended. They are going to be upset. You cannot make it so that people will not get offended and upset and harmed. That's not really how it works when you're working with other people. People hurt each other. What you can do is try to respond when that happens, to see where it comes from, to do repair work, because that's actually what I see that doesn't happen, is that there's no repair work. People are just like, I say what I want to say and that's it. It's actually the next steps after the harm that I think matter more than anything else. And this is very hard to do, but I don't think that education can actually be safe, because you are introducing people to new ideas, things they've never heard before, things that contradict what they've heard from their home, from their places of worship, from the media. You are introducing all sorts of ideas. So if you're thinking that's going to be safe, mentally, that's not always true. What I do hope we can guarantee is people's physical safety. To me, that's a different issue. But when you're dealing with the ideas of the world, I just don't know that if safety should be our goal. Our goal should be to develop practices for safe care, for discernment. This is one of my favorite words. For being, I don't even like the word respectful, because that's not quite what I mean, because sometimes people think respectful is tolerance, but like making good arguments, learning how to disagree without necessarily, using arguments that are against the person themselves, but about their arguments. This is so much more difficult And we don't all have good tools for doing it. I just try to start there. But I don't let my students know that this is gonna be a safe. They're going to read things that they are gonna find incredibly offensive and that do erase them, you know? That is part of what it means to be an educated person. That's what you are exposing to yourself when you read. You have to know, how do I respond to that? And I always say, it's so much more about that other person when you read these sorts of things than it is about you. They aren't actually talking about you. They don't know you. They are actually revealing all these things about themselves. And you sort of have to build up a skin to be like, you know, I know that this person is trying to hurt me, but you know, they can't rob me of my joy. That's really what I think about.
Can I ask so go ahead.
I would just add to that is, I know particularly with book bans and culture wars and having a lot of these conversations, for many of us, they're tied to our lived everyday experience. And it's oftentimes hard to take the emotion out of that. But in these spaces, particularly in spaces of institutions of higher learning and having critical educational debates, it's important for us to go in with that discernment and understanding that I know I may be triggered, if that's the word that we want to use, but how do I handle that? What is the worst thing? I always go into spaces thinking, what is the worst thing people can say to me that will make me act outside of my character or make me go to a different place, and try my best to prepare for that, because I know that the state of the world right now, the state of our country right now, when it comes to some of these difficult topics, I know it's not safe. I know it's not safe to share my opinions in a lot of spaces and what I believe and what I feel and how they impact me. But the key thing I believe is going into those spaces with that understanding and keeping that intellectual curiosity, because I think it's incumbent upon us to understand the other side. As much as it may be, whatever that other side is for you, as much as it may, you know, inside disagree with your being, I think it's important that we find some sort of perspective taking, because that will help us with our arguments. It helps us to know what the other side or what the opponent is thinking and what they believe and where their frame of reference is coming from. And I know it's hard to do that in the moment, but I think coming into those spaces and coming into these spaces with that mindset that I want to learn and that I may be triggered in this process of learning, and how do I handle that, and setting tools up for yourself to prepare for that.
Can I jump in? So, yes. Of course, yeah. Sometimes when I do ethics training, my last slide is like the 3 C's of, I don't know, moving forward. Curiosity, compassion, and courage. Right? These things are obviously needed. The curiosity piece we've talked about. The compassion piece is also like, I mean, even when like the bad guy is saying to me stuff, why? What's going on in the bad guy? Right? That's the compassion piece, to try to just understand that other people have some other drama that they're living out. And then the courage part is like, we just have to say the truth, you know, and it's gonna hurt sometimes. Can I add something else about this that, I mean, I think as Americans, we don't celebrate the beauty of the First Amendment. I mean, we are so privileged to live in this country where we have a First Amendment that protects our freedoms in this way. And the courts have done a fairly good job of sorting out issues about freedom of speech. You may not agree with all of the court cases, but there are parts of the world where you cannot publish books. There are parts of the world where blasphemy is against the law. There are parts of the world where women continue to be oppressed in horrifying ways. I think, you know, part of it is like, we're all Americans here, and that framework that gives us the ability to talk and discuss, we don't want to ever lose track of that. But I think sometimes, like, we don't have good civic education on this. Like, I think some people don't even know what the First Amendment is all about, right? So like, maybe the first place to start is the legal, political framework. And then critical thinking, as you were saying, like, I mean, we need better arguments, folks. Like, I mean, you can't just make fun of, I mean, there's someone in our current political dynamic that consistently belittles and makes fun of all the people that he's opposed to. That's just bad discourse, right? And we need to point that out, that that's bad discourse, and then we need to do better. Not make those kind of ad hominem arguments, not just commit fallacy after fallacy. And that's our job, right, as educators. Like, we need to teach people to think better and to understand
So,
the First Amendment framework.
Just to wrap up, I'm hearing that there's a large skill set that has to really be pursued, and in these conversations, perhaps even taking a moment to be like, hey, I know everything's getting heated here. Let's dial it back, let's take a few breaths, and then now let's actually talk in a different register about what's actually going on. Maybe starting with that transition point and learning how to do that transition point so that we can get to the argument from truth. That's what I'm taking away from this. That's all the time that we have, but if you would like to ask questions of me or any of the panel, I'm sure they're available by email. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you tonight at 6.
This is my mark. This was the letter regarding President Cummings. If you're interested in that, go. Oh, you already have it. You're welcome. Is it in the same room? Okay. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much.
I had heard about it and I meant to read everything before I got here, but they were talking about it. I was like, oh yes, okay. So I was trying not to refer to it, you know, just for here, but I will. So I'll talk about it more. Yeah.
I had a question about that.
Oh, okay. What was your question?
So I'm a library member. And my argument is that what they're saying is, you're not understanding that.